it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Tonight, we unravel one of history's most profound transformations, a change so complete that we can barely imagine life before it happened. Capitalism seems eternal, natural, even inevitable. Yet, as a system, it's less than 500 years old. How did we get here? How did a system of exchange become the system for everything? And when did market logic consume it all? Land, labor, time, even life itself. 500 years ago, the world ran on entirely different rules. Most humans never touched money. You grew your own food, made your own clothes, and shared common land with your neighbors. The market was a place you went on Tuesday, not an invisible force that governed your life. Then, something changed. A new system emerged that would transform not just how things were made, but the very meaning of being human. This is the story of how capitalism went from an experiment in a few European cities to the organizing principle of human civilization. We'll explore how it happened, who resisted, and the moment it became so dominant, we forgot it even had a beginning. Along the way, we'll meet the architects who built this system and those who resisted it, discovering how their struggle created the world we inhabit today. Before we dive in, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. So, let's now begin to trace the most extraordinary transformation of humanity in our history. This is the story of how capitalism changed the world forever. Chapter 1: The World Before Capitalism. In 1780, the world made cotton in 10,000 different ways. A farmer in Gujarat planted cotton shrubs between his rows of rice, watching the white bolls emerge like small miracles alongside the grain that would feed his family through the monsoon season. Half a world away, a woman in West Africa interplanted her cotton with yams and maize, the three crops growing together in ancient harmony. Later, she would sit behind her house, working fibers into cloth on a backstrap loom, her fingers moving in patterns her grandmother's grandmother had taught. This was how humanity had always made things, with hands that knew their work intimately. The pace was unhurried, almost meditative. A weaver might use the same loom her great-grandmother had worked, not from poverty, but from a kind of wisdom we've forgotten. These tools had been perfected across centuries until they fit human hands like water fits a cup. The cloth that emerged might travel along trade routes older than written history, but its making remained scaled to the rhythm of seasons and the reach of human arms. Nobody understood this art better than India. For 3,000 years, Indian weavers had been creating textiles so fine that poets struggled to name them. They called the muslins of Dhaka woven wind, morning dew, running water. A length of the finest cloth could slip through a wedding ring like silk through fingers. When Marco Polo reached the Coromandel coast, he wrote in wonder about cottons more beautiful than any he'd imagined possible. These weren't mere trade goods, but expressions of civilization itself, serving as currency, diplomatic gifts, declarations of what human hands could achieve when given time and tradition. Yet most Europeans in 1780 had never felt cotton against their skin. They wore scratchy wool from local sheep and stiff linen from flax grown in their own fields, accepting discomfort as they accepted cold winters and coarse bread. They lived under feudalism, where the manor lord owned the land in name, but ownership meant something utterly different from what we know today. Peasants held rights that ran deeper than any charter, rights centered on the commons, those shared spaces that belonged to everyone and no one. The commons were everything. When your wheat harvest failed, you could trap rabbits in the common forest. When winter crept through your cottage walls, you gathered fuel from the common heath. Every village had its common pasture where cattle grazed, its common stream where anyone could fish. But these spaces provided more than survival. They were where village life truly happened, where decisions were made collectively and even the poorest voice could speak. Women especially found freedom here, washing clothes at the stream or gathering herbs in the meadow, talking beyond the reach of husbands and fathers and priests. Life was hard under this system, sometimes brutal, but never static. The relationship between those who worked the land and those who claimed to own it was one of constant negotiation, punctuated by resistance that took 1,000 forms. Serfs worked slowly when watched, forgot instructions, lost track of livestock. When pushed too far, entire villages might melt into the forest, leaving fields untended and rents uncollected. Sometimes resistance exploded into revolution. The heretical movements that swept through medieval Europe weren't just religious disputes, but attempts to remake the world. The Cathars created communities where property was shared and women preached. The Waldenses declared wealth itself a sin. These groups formed what one scholar calls the First Proletarian International, a network of the dispossessed living by radically different rules. The Church's fury in destroying them revealed how deeply they threatened not just religious doctrine, but the entire architecture of power. In 1381, these tensions erupted in England when the radical priest John Ball asked a question that cut through centuries of justification. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? His logic was devastating. In Eden, there had been no lords and serfs. Hierarchy was man's invention, not God's will. The uprising that followed saw peasant armies march on London, demanding the commons be restored, serfdom abolished, church wealth distributed to the poor. For one terrifying moment, the old order trembled. Then came betrayal, execution, the restoration of power through spectacular violence. Yet Ball's vision refused to die. It lived on in folk songs and kitchen conversations, in the stubborn belief that the world could be otherwise. This was the world before capitalism, imperfect, often cruel, but organized around survival rather than profit. The Indian weaver at his loom, the African woman in her garden, the European peasant in his field, all participated in systems that kept communities whole across generations. This world would not surrender quietly. Its destruction would require violence on a scale that still shocks. The commons would be enclosed, their communities scattered like seeds on the wind. Human beings would be transformed into property. Time itself would be carved into units, to be bought and sold. The 10,000 ways of making cotton would be replaced by a single system that wrapped the globe in its iron logic. That system would begin with what historians now call war capitalism, and every thread of its foundation would be dyed in blood. Chapter 2: The Rise of War Capitalism. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497, his ships heavy with cannons that would speak a language the Indian Ocean had never heard. For centuries, these waters had known commerce as conversation. Arab dhows laden with frankincense, Chinese junks carrying porcelain, Indian vessels filled with cotton cloth so fine it seemed woven from moonlight. Merchants competed through quality and price, through relationships nurtured across generations like gardens. Da Gama brought something different. He brought the argument of gunpowder. 5 years earlier, Columbus had stumbled upon the Americas while searching for a western route to those same Indian markets. These 2 voyages would reshape the world more profoundly than any emperor's conquest. Together, they launched what the historian Sven Beckert calls war capitalism. Not trade as the world had known it, but commerce, married to violence, a system that would transform human beings into cargo and entire continents into possessions. This wasn't some natural evolution of markets finding their level. It was a counter-revolution dressed in the clothes of progress. For more than a century, European peasants had been winning their quiet battles against the nobility. Through patient resistance and occasional revolt, they'd secured higher wages, shorter working days, the right to simply walk away from estates that treated them poorly. By the late 15th century, a common laborer in England ate better than his grandfather had dreamed possible. Lords watched their power drain away like water through cupped hands. The ruling classes understood the crisis perfectly. If European workers demanded too much, they would find new workers elsewhere. If European land wasn't profitable enough, they would take land elsewhere. The world beyond Europe would become their solution, their escape from the trap of their own people's expectations. What they created was breathtaking. In its calculated brutality, a world split in 2, with law and order at home, pure violence abroad. The Portuguese showed exactly how this would work. European merchants couldn't match Indian textiles or Chinese craftsmanship, but they could blow competing ships to splinters. They established fortified factories, not places where things were made, but militarized compounds where trade happened at cannon point. The Dutch seized Batavia. The British built armed settlements at Surat and Madras. These trading companies were something new under the sun. Corporations with armies, businesses that could wage war and sign treaties like nations. Meanwhile, the Spanish conquistadors had found silver in the Americas in quantities that made European kings dizzy with possibility. The mines of Potosi produced wealth that flowed like a river of moonlight across the Atlantic, financing adventures everywhere else. This treasure bought the ships and cannons that forced entry into Asian markets. It purchased the Indian textiles that would become currency for an even darker trade. The theft of American land had created a problem. The indigenous people had died in unimaginable numbers from disease and slaughter. European workers were expensive and unwilling to labor under Killing Sunday. The solution came from Africa, where Portuguese traders had been buying human beings since the 1450s. What began as a trickle became a flood. Over 3 centuries, at least 12 million Africans would cross the Atlantic in chains, packed into ships like goods, though they were people with names and memories and children who would never see them again. A triangle of horror emerged, linking 3 continents in a web that trapped millions. Ships carried Indian cotton to Africa, where cloth had become the currency for purchasing human souls. Those souls were carried to American plantations where they grew sugar that sweetened European tea, tobacco that filled European pipes, and eventually cotton that would feed new machines. The profits flowed back to Europe, funding more ships, more weapons, more misery. The East India Company celebrated this arrangement in dispatches that spoke of supplying textiles for a trade, on which the well-being of the British plantations so much depends, as if human suffering were merely a line in a ledger. This was the first truly global economy, and every thread of it was dyed in blood. War capitalism had created something genuinely new, a world where violence wasn't a breakdown of commerce, but its very foundation. The age had begun that would transform not just how things were made and sold, but what it meant to be human, in a world where everything, even souls, had become commodities. Chapter 3: Enclosures and the Creation of the Proletariat. While ships heavy with human cargo crossed the Atlantic, while Indian weavers were forced at gunpoint to sell their finest muslins for pittances, another violence was reshaping the world. This one moved more quietly, creeping across the English countryside like frost. The hedges went up at night, while villagers slept. Work crews planted hawthorn seedlings in freshly dug ditches, marking lines across fields that had been open for 1,000 years. By morning, the common pasture where everyone's cattle grazed had become private property, belonging to whoever held the newest deed from Parliament. The people who actually worked the land would wake to find themselves trespassers on ground their families had walked for generations. This was happening all across England in the early 1500s. The enclosure movement, as historians would later call it, was transforming the countryside from a patchwork of common fields and shared resources into a checkerboard of private estates. The writer, Thomas More, watching villages emptied and demolished to make way for sheep pastures, wrote with bitter irony that the sheep had become so great devourers that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. More understood what was happening. The lords who owned England's estates had discovered that wool was more profitable than tenants. Flemish textile manufacturers were desperate for English wool, and prices had tripled in a generation. 1,000 sheep required only a shepherd or two, while the same land might support dozens of tenant families who paid modest rents and caused endless trouble with their complaints about repairs and their claims to ancient rights. The economics was straightforward. The people had to go. For rural families, the enclosures meant the end of a way of life that stretched back to Saxon times. The commons had never been wasteland, as the landlords claimed. They were the difference between survival and starvation. Your cow grazed on the common pasture. Your pigs rooted in the common wood. You cut turf from the common bog for winter fuel. You caught rabbits on the common heath when harvests were thin. Without these resources, a family couldn't survive on wages alone, even if there were wages to be had. The historian W.G. Hoskins would later call this process the Great Plunder, and the name fits. Between 1500 and 1600, about a quarter of England's land was enclosed. Whole villages disappeared. Where once stood clusters of cottages surrounded by strips of cultivated land, now stretched empty sheep runs. The people who had lived there scattered to the roads, becoming what the authorities called vagabonds and masterless men, dangerous precisely because they belonged to no one and nowhere. Resistance flared wherever enclosures appeared. Levelling the hedges became the most common form of protest in Tudor England. Villagers would gather after dark to fill in the ditches, uproot the hawthorn, and throw open the land again. Sometimes the resistance grew larger. In 1549, 16,000 rebels gathered in Norfolk under Robert Kett, a landowner who had turned against his own class. They camped on Mousehold Heath above Norwich and issued demands that from henceforth no man shall enclose any more. They wanted all bondmen made free. They wanted the commons restored. The rebellion lasted 2 months. The rebels defeated a royal army and captured Norwich, England's second largest city. It took foreign mercenaries and artillery to finally crush them. Kett was hanged from Norwich Castle walls, his body left in chains as a warning to others who might challenge the new order. But the enclosures continued. By 1700, they had transformed England from a nation of peasant farmers into a nation of wage workers. The state played a crucial role in this transformation. Parliament passed what became known as the Bloody Laws, legislation that turned poverty itself into a crime. Under Henry VIII, vagabonds were branded with hot irons on their first arrest, enslaved on their second, and hanged on their third. Thousands died on the gallows for the crime of being without work in a world that had taken away their means of working for themselves. new institutions emerged to discipline this displaced population. Workhouses and houses of correction spread across England and then continental Europe. These were essentially prisons where the poor were forced to work for their bread, spinning thread or picking oakum or breaking stones. The message was clear. You would work for wages on whatever terms were offered, or you would be forced to work for nothing at all. The enclosures broke more than economic relationships. They destroyed the social fabric of rural life. The commons had been where May Day was celebrated, where harvest festivals brought villages together, where young people met and courted. Their loss created what the scholar Silvia Federici calls a social enclosure, the dissolution of the bonds that had held communities together through good times and bad. Women experienced this transformation in particularly harsh ways. In the village economy, their work had been visible and valued. They managed dairies, tended gardens, raised poultry, brewed ale. They knew which herbs cured fevers and eased difficult births. This knowledge and labor had clear worth in a world where most of what a family needed was produced at home. But wage labor was mostly closed to women. The new economy valued only work done for money, rendering invisible the cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and cloth-making that remained essential for survival. Women found themselves dependent on male wages in ways they had never been before. By the early 17th century, England had been remade. The proletariat, as Marx would later name them, had been created through systematic violence. They owned nothing but their ability to work. They had no choice but to sell that ability to whoever would buy it, on whatever terms were offered. The ground was prepared for the next stage of capitalism's development. The factories were coming, and they would need workers who had already been taught that they had no alternative but to submit to the discipline of the machine. Chapter 4: The Great Witch Hunt and the War on Women. The same violence that drove peasants from their commons found another target. As enclosures destroyed the economic independence of rural communities, a parallel assault began on the women who had sustained those communities through their knowledge and labor. The fires that would consume hundreds of thousands of women across Europe started burning in earnest around 1580, just as capitalism needed to transform not only how people worked, but how they reproduced. The emerging capitalist system required more than enclosed land and masterless men forced to sell their labor. It needed those men to be born, fed, clothed, and cared for day after day, generation after generation. This vast work of creating and maintaining human beings had always been women's domain, performed within networks of mutual aid that gave women considerable autonomy and social power. Such independence could not be tolerated in a system that needed to control every aspect of production, including the production of workers themselves. The witch hunts were capitalism's solution to this problem. By terrorizing women into submission, by destroying their networks of knowledge and mutual support, by redefining their bodies as property of church and state, the hunts created what Silvia Federici calls the modern patriarchy. a system where women's essential labor would be commanded for free, where their bodies would serve as factories producing the next generation of workers, where their subordination would be so complete it would seem natural, even divinely ordained. This was not some medieval madness, but a thoroughly modern terror. The Middle Ages had actually seen little witch persecution. The Church had even declared belief in witches' magical powers to be heresy. Canon law stated that anyone who believed women could fly through the night with the goddess Diana was falling into pagan superstition. Something changed dramatically in the late 15th century, just as feudalism began its collapse and the new economic order started taking shape. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, became the manual for this new persecution. Written by two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, it provided a complete guide to identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. The book argued that women were naturally more susceptible to the devil due to their insatiable lust and weak minds. Witchcraft, it declared, stemmed from female carnality. The text was reprinted 14 times between 1487 and 1520, spreading across Europe like the plague it resembled. The infrastructure of persecution required enormous state resources. New laws made witchcraft a capital crime. Special courts were established with simplified procedures that made conviction easier. Professional witch-finders traveled from town to town, paid by the head for each witch they discovered. Matthew Hopkins, England's witch-finder general, earned 20 shillings per witch in an era when a labourer made 6pence a day. This required, as one historian notes, much official organisation and administration. Both Protestant and Catholic states participated with equal enthusiasm. The specific charges revealed what authorities truly feared. The papal bull of 1484, Summis Desiderantes, focused obsessively on reproduction. It accused witches of destroying the offspring of women, of hindering men from generating and women from conceiving. They supposedly caused cattle to miscarry, crops to fail, and milk to sour. But always, the emphasis returned to controlling birth and death, to women's power over reproduction. Midwives faced particular danger. They knew which herbs prevented pregnancy, which eased difficult births, which ended unwanted pregnancies. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries and passed from mother to daughter, was now redefined as commerce with the devil. A midwife in Germany was burned for showing women how to control their fertility. Another in Scotland was executed for easing the pains of childbirth, violating God's curse that women should bring forth children in sorrow. Europe was experiencing a demographic catastrophe. Wars, plagues, and famines had decimated the population. Labor was scarce and therefore expensive. The emerging capitalist class needed workers desperately, and the state had decided that women's bodies would provide them. Contraception became a capital crime. Abortion was punished by death. Even remarriage for widows was discouraged. The womb, as Federici writes, became public territory, controlled by men and the state. Women who had once managed their own reproduction were transformed into breeding machines for the new economy. The hunt simultaneously destroyed women's role in medicine. For centuries, women had been the primary healers in rural communities. They possessed empirical knowledge of herbs and treatments tested over generations. The emerging profession of male physicians saw them as competition. By eliminating female healers as witches, the medical establishment erected what one scholar calls a wall of unchallengeable scientific knowledge. Women were excluded from universities, from medical guilds, from formal practice. Their traditional remedies were dismissed as superstition at best, diabolic at worst. Beyond the economic motivations lay a deeper terror of female autonomy. The witch embodied everything the new order feared in women. She was the scold who talked back to her husband. She was the widow living alone without male supervision. She was the woman who refused to remarry, who controlled her own property, who gathered with other women to gossip and laugh. The trials forced women to testify against their neighbors, shattering the networks of mutual aid that had sustained them through hard times. The confessions extracted under torture painted a revealing picture. Witches supposedly gathered at the Sabbat, a nocturnal assembly where they feasted and danced and copulated with demons. They inverted every social norm, placing pleasure before duty, night before day, women before men. These fantasies reflected real memories of peasant gatherings where communities planned resistance, celebrated harvests, and momentarily escaped the grinding discipline of work. By demonizing such gatherings, authorities criminalized any collective joy that might threaten the new capitalist order. The witch hunts ended by the late 17th century, their purpose achieved. Women's medical knowledge had been expropriated or destroyed. Their control over reproduction had been broken. Their social networks had been shattered. The new ideal woman was emerging, silent, obedient, confined to the home, her labor invisible and unpaid, yet absolutely essential. She would reproduce the workforce, maintain the household, and provide emotional support, all without wages, all without recognition. The witches were gone, but the system that burned them was just beginning its long domination of the world. Chapter 5. The Plantation Factory Nexus. The fires had done their work. By 1700, women across Europe had been terrorized into a new kind of submission. Their bodies transformed into machines for producing workers, their labor made invisible and unpaid. But capitalism's hunger was only beginning. The system that had enclosed the commons and burned the witches now turned its attention to a grander project, mechanizing production itself. And for that, it would need to perfect the most brutal labor system the world had ever known. The connection revealed itself first in the cotton mills of Manchester. By 1790, the new spinning frames could process cotton faster than human hands had ever managed. The jenny, the water frame, the mule. These inventions transformed raw fiber into thread at speeds that seemed miraculous. But they created a crisis. The machines were hungry, and traditional suppliers in the Ottoman Empire and West Indies couldn't grow enough cotton to feed them. The Industrial Revolution threatened to stall before it had truly begun. The solution came from across the Atlantic. The newly independent United States possessed something Europe lacked: seemingly endless land taken from native peoples. Between 1790 and 1820, American settlers seized millions of acres from the Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw nations, transforming ancient hunting grounds into cotton fields. This stolen land would become the Cotton Kingdom, stretching from Georgia to Texas. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, invented in 1793, made this transformation possible. Before the gin, separating seeds from cotton fiber took a full day to process a single pound. Whitney's machine could clean 50 pounds in the same time. Suddenly, short staple cotton, which grew readily in the American interior, became profitable. A cotton rush swept the South. Production exploded from 1.5 million pounds in 1790 to over 167 million by 1820. This explosion required labor on an unprecedented scale. Planters found their workforce through what historians call the domestic slave trade. Between 1800 and 1860, slave traders forced 1 million enslaved people from Virginia and Maryland to the new cotton states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Families were torn apart, children sold away from parents, husbands from wives. This second Middle Passage, as survivors called it, was a catastrophe that rivaled the original Atlantic crossing in its cruelty. The cotton plantation was not some backward institution, but a highly sophisticated operation that prefigured the modern factory. Planters divided their fields into precise units, assigned specific tasks to each worker, and used bells to regulate the working day. They kept detailed accounts of productivity, calculating exactly how many pounds each enslaved person picked. When cotton prices rose in Liverpool, the effects were immediate. As fugitive slave John Brown recalled, when the price rises in the English market, the poor slaves immediately feel the effects, for they are harder driven, and the whip is kept more constantly going. European banks financed this entire system. Baring Brothers of London, Brown Brothers of Liverpool, and other banking houses provided the credit that allowed planters to buy land and slaves. Enslaved people themselves became collateral for loans, what one historian calls slavery's invisible engine. A planter could mortgage his slaves to buy more slaves, using human beings as capital to expand production. By 1830, 1 in 13 Americans was enslaved, and most were growing cotton. After Congress banned the international slave trade in 1807, planters turned to what they called natural increase. Enslaved women were forced to bear children who would become the next generation of workers. Women who didn't produce enough children faced punishment or sale. This policy transformed wombs into sites of capital accumulation. paralleling the control over reproduction happening simultaneously in Europe. Some women resisted through abortion or infanticide, choosing to deny the system new workers, even at tremendous personal cost. By 1850, American slaves were producing 2/3 of the world's cotton, the cloth made from their labor-clothed workers in Manchester, Moscow, and Milan. The profits from their toil built railroads, funded factories, and underwrote the insurance companies and banks that still dominate global finance. The Industrial Revolution was built on a foundation of stolen land and stolen labor. Without the cotton picked by enslaved hands, the factories of Europe would have fallen silent. Chapter 6: The Great Transformation. The Rise of the Factory System. While enslaved people picked cotton under the Mississippi sun, something was stirring in the damp valleys of northern England. In cottage after cottage, weavers worked their looms by candlelight, throwing the shuttle back and forth in a rhythm as old as civilization itself. John Kay, a weaver from Lancashire, grew tired of this ancient dance. His arms ached, his shoulders burned from the repetitive motion. In 1733, he invented something he called the flying shuttle, a simple device that would set in motion changes no one could have imagined. Kay's shuttle flew across the loom at the pull of a cord, doubling a weaver's speed overnight. It seemed like pure progress, but progress has a way of creating its own problems. Now one weaver could work as fast as two, which meant they needed twice as much thread. The spinners, mostly women working wheels in their cottages, couldn't keep pace. Where once 5 spinners had kept one weaver supplied, now it took 8 or 10. Thread became precious. Weavers sat idle, waiting. The textile trade had been thrown completely off balance by one man's clever invention. For decades, this imbalance tormented the industry. Then solutions began emerging from the workshops and sheds of northern England, created by men who understood thread through touch rather than theory. James Hargreaves was a weaver with too many children and too little money. The story goes that his daughter Jenny knocked over the family spinning wheel one day in the 1760s. As it lay on its side, still spinning, Hargreaves noticed something. The spindle was now horizontal rather than vertical, yet it still worked. Perhaps, he thought, you could line up many spindles in a row, all spinning at once. The machine Hargreaves built, which he called the Jenny after his daughter, could spin 8 threads simultaneously, then 16, eventually over 100. When local spinners heard about it, they knew what it meant for their livelihoods. They broke into his workshop and smashed his machines to pieces. Hargreaves fled to Nottingham, where mill owners with money and influence helped him rebuild. Despite the violence, the Jenny spread across England like wildfire. Thread was finally becoming plentiful. Around the same time, Richard Arkwright, a traveling barber who knew nothing about textiles, met a clockmaker named John Kay, different from the shuttle inventor, who had ideas about using rollers to draw out cotton fibers. Arkwright had what Kay lacked: the gift of persuasion and an eye for opportunity. Together they created the water frame, a machine that used river power to turn rollers that stretched and twisted cotton into strong, uniform thread. Unlike the jenny, which could fit in a cottage, the water frame was massive. It needed flowing water to power it and a building large enough to contain it. These new machines weren't just faster than human hands. They operated on a completely different scale. In India, where the finest cotton had been spun for 3,000 years, it took 50,000 hours to spin 100 pounds of raw cotton into thread. A British mill using the new machinery could do the same work in a few hundred hours. By 1800, with steam power added to the mix, that time had dropped to barely over 100 hours. The mathematics were revolutionary. Samuel Gregg understood what these machines demanded. In 1784, he built Quarrybank Mill on the River Bollin in Cheshire, one of the first true factories. It rose 4 stories high in red brick, looking more like a fortress than a workplace. The river turned an enormous iron wheel that powered machines throughout the building through an elaborate system of gears and belts. Inside, the noise was overwhelming, the air thick with cotton dust. Children as young as 7 worked among the machines, their small fingers tying broken threads for 14 hours a day. Time itself bent to the machine's rhythm. Workers lived by the factory bell rather than the Sunday. The industrial age had begun, and soon these mills would transform not just how cloth was made, but how millions of people would spend their waking hours. Chapter 7: Discipline and Resistance. Ellen Houghton was 10 years old when she testified before Parliament in 1833. She worked as a piecer in a Manchester cotton mill, tying broken threads back together as the machines spun. Her day began at 5:30 in the morning and ended at 8 at night. When she made mistakes or moved too slowly, the overseer hung an iron weight around her neck and forced her to walk the factory floor as an example to others. She was not unusual. Half of all cotton workers were children, some as young as 5. The factory owners had discovered that children made ideal workers. Their small fingers could reach into the machinery to tie broken threads. They couldn't organize strikes. They could be beaten without consequence. Many were parish apprentices, taken from poorhouses and bound to the factory for 7 years. These children were effectively slaves, working without wages, sleeping in shifts in beds that never grew cold, one child rising as another lay down. Women made up most of the remaining workforce, young, unmarried women especially, who had few other options for survival after the enclosures destroyed rural life. The mill owners paid them half what they paid men for the same work. They justified this by claiming women were naturally suited to the repetitive tasks of tending machines, that their nimble fingers and patient temperaments made them perfect for factory work. The real reason was simpler. Women had less power to resist. Life inside the mills was unlike anything humanity had experienced before. The working day was regulated by bells and whistles, not sunrise and sunset. Every movement was monitored by overseers who prowled the factory floor. Workers faced fines for opening windows, for washing hands, for whistling, for being 3 minutes late. The punishment system was elaborate and cruel. At one mill, the overseer nailed the ears of child workers to a table. At another, children were plunged into cisterns of cold water to keep them awake during their 14-hour shifts. The state backed this brutality with law. Britain's 1823 Master and Servant Act made breaking a labor contract a criminal offence. Workers who left their jobs could be hunted down and imprisoned. Those who organized unions faced transportation to Australia. The message was clear. The proletariat would submit to factory discipline or face the full force of state violence. This new system created what Silvia Federici calls the patriarchy of the wage. Men's wages became the primary source of family survival, giving them power over wives and children. Women's work in the home, cooking, cleaning, raising children, was redefined as non-work, natural female duty rather than labor-deserving compensation. The male worker's wife became, in Federici's words, the substitute for the land lost to the enclosures, their most basic means of reproduction, and a communal good. This division shattered the solidarity between men and women that had characterized earlier resistance movements. Yet workers fought back constantly. At one English mill, 119 of 780 apprentices ran away. This hemorrhage of workers was a crisis for manufacturers who needed steady labor to keep their machines running. When individual resistance failed, workers turned to collective action. The Luddites smashed the machines that were destroying their livelihoods between 1811 and 1812. They formed secret unions despite the threat of transportation. In 1824, workers at a Pawtucket, Rhode Island mill organized America's first factory strike. The Manchester Cotton Spinners Society emerged from these struggles, organizing thousands of workers across the industry. They demanded 10-hour working days instead of 14. They wanted safety regulations for the deadly machinery. They fought for the right to open windows in the suffocating mills. Every gain was won through strikes, demonstrations, and the threat of shutting down production. The making of the modern proletariat was not a smooth process, but a running battle that continues to this day. Chapter 8: The Deindustrialization of the South. For centuries, European merchants had sailed to India, seeking cotton cloth they couldn't produce themselves. The muslins of Dhaka, the calicos of Calicut, the chintzes of Madras were treasures more valuable than gold. By 1800, this ancient trade was about to reverse. The machines of Manchester would destroy in decades what Indian weavers had built over millennia. The transformation happened with stunning speed. British cotton exports to Europe increased more than 20-fold between 1780 and 1805. The new machine-spun yarn was coarser than Indian thread, the cloth rougher than Indian weaves, but it was cheap, incredibly, impossibly cheap, A piece of cloth that took an Indian weaver weeks to complete could be produced by British machines in hours. India bore the brunt of this assault. Between 1800 and 1810, cloth exports from Bengal to Britain fell by over 75%. The direction of trade reversed entirely. Where India had once clothed Europe, now Europe clothed India. By the 1830s, British cotton goods flooded Indian markets, selling for less than local weavers could afford to buy raw cotton. Entire communities of artisans faced starvation. A British colonial report from 1874 described the devastation with clinical detachment. The importation of cheap machine-made piece goods has in many parts driven the native spinners and weavers altogether out of the market, and many have had to take to working on the roads or have been engaged as farm laborers. Generations of accumulated skill, centuries of craft knowledge, vanished in a single generation. This wasn't simply market competition. The British colonial state actively destroyed Indian manufacturing to benefit Lancashire mills. They imposed tariffs that protected British goods while exposing Indian products to ruinous competition. Colonial officials studied Indian designs and sent samples back to Manchester, where manufacturers copied patterns that had been perfected over centuries. Edmund Potter, a leading Manchester industrialist, celebrated this destruction, hoping Indian weavers would abandon their ill-paid operations and return to agricultural operations, growing raw cotton for British mills. The pattern repeated across the globe. China was forced to open its markets after the 1842 Treaty of Nanking. British and American textiles flooded in, devastating local hand spinners who had supplied cloth for the world's largest population. In Mexico, the artisan textile industry of cities like Guadalajara was virtually eliminated before protectionist tariffs were finally enacted. Ancient weaving traditions from Java to Peru crumbled before the mechanical onslaught. This deindustrialization was primitive accumulation on a global scale. Just as enclosures had stripped European peasants of their land, industrial competition stripped entire nations of their manufacturing capacity. Regions that had produced sophisticated goods for centuries were transformed into suppliers of raw materials. India, which had clothed the world, was reduced to growing cotton for British factories. China, which had pioneered countless technologies, became a market for Western machinery. The transformation created what we now call the Global South, a vast periphery dependent on an industrial core. Local economies that had been largely self-sufficient became trapped in relationships of permanent dependency. They sold raw materials at prices set in London and bought manufactured goods at prices they couldn't control. This was underdevelopment being systematically created. The inequalities established during this period persist today. Nations that were deindustrialized in the 19th century remain primarily exporters of raw materials in the 21st. The wealth extracted during those decades of destruction funded Europe's railways, its universities, its cultural institutions. The poverty created by that extraction still defines life for billions. The empire of cotton had remade the world, and the world has never recovered. Chapter 9. The American Civil War. The world that industrial capitalism had built was about to tear itself apart. By 1860, the global economy ran on cotton, picked by 4 million enslaved Americans, processed in the factories of Manchester and sold in markets from Moscow to Mumbai. This entire system, the plantations and mills, the ships and railways, the banks and merchant houses, depended on the continuation of slavery. When Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, they shattered more than the American Union. They triggered the first great crisis of the industrial age. Senator James Henry Hammond had stood before Congress just 3 years earlier and declared the South invincible. "No power on earth dares to make war upon it," he thundered. "Cotton is king." He had reason for such confidence. The American South produced 77% of Britain's cotton, 90% of France's, 92% of Russia's. The deindustrialization of India and China had created a world utterly dependent on American slave labor. Hammond believed this made the peculiar institution untouchable. The war would prove him catastrophically wrong. When Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, they triggered more than an American Civil War. They set off the first global crisis of industrial capitalism. The Union Navy immediately blockaded southern ports, cutting off the cotton that fed the world's factories. Exports collapsed from 3.8 million bales in 1860 to virtually nothing by 1862. Mills from Manchester to Moscow ground to a halt. Lancashire, the heartland of British industry, faced catastrophe. By 1863, a quarter of its population was unemployed. Soup kitchens opened in towns that had generated enormous wealth. Workers who had operated the most advanced machinery in the world now broke stones for pennies a day. Riots erupted in Stalybridge and Ashton. The same crisis struck France, Germany, and Russia. The entire industrial order, built on southern cotton and slave labor, was collapsing. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, understood the stakes perfectly. "We cannot allow millions of our people to perish," he warned Parliament. The cotton famine transformed what merchants had managed privately into matters of state. Governments that had preached free trade now scrambled desperately to secure raw materials. The global search for cotton became as urgent as any military campaign. India became the first target of this scramble. Its share of the British cotton market jumped from 16% in 1860 to 75% in 1862. But Indian cotton was shorter, coarser, harder to work. More importantly, Indian peasants grew cotton alongside food crops for local markets. They had no interest in producing for Manchester. The British colonial state responded with massive coercion. They built railroads to connect cotton-growing regions to ports. They rewrote land laws to create private property that could be mortgaged. They imposed new taxes, payable only in cash, forcing peasants to grow cotton for export. Egypt underwent similar transformation. Production quintupled between 1860 and 1865 as European capital poured in. Peasants were forced to abandon food crops for cotton. When they resisted, the Egyptian government used corvée labor, essentially temporary enslavement, to ensure production. Brazil doubled its exports using similar methods. From India to Egypt to Brazil, the cotton famine was restructuring the countryside of 3 continents. Meanwhile, enslaved Americans were writing their own chapter of history. They fled plantations by the hundreds of thousands, many joining the Union Army. Their mass desertion made the Confederacy's collapse inevitable. By war's end, 4 million people had freed themselves from bondage. This victory terrified global capitalists. How could cotton be produced without slavery? Would freed people, like those in Haiti and Jamaica, retreat into subsistence farming? 1. 5. The answer came quickly and brutally. Southern states passed black codes that essentially re-enslaved African Americans through debt, peonage, and sharecropping. Vagrancy laws allowed authorities to arrest anyone without employment and lease them to planters. The whip of the master was replaced by the coercion of the market and the violence of the state. Similar systems emerged wherever cotton was grown. Indian peasants were trapped in debt to merchants. Egyptian farmers faced forced labor. Brazilian workers were tied to plantations through contracts they couldn't read. The Civil War had ended slavery, but not exploitation. It had revealed capitalism's absolute dependence on coerced labor, and shown that when one form of coercion became untenable, the system would quickly develop others. The cotton famine had globalized these new forms of exploitation, spreading them across continents. Cotton was still king, but now it ruled through debt and law rather than chains and whips. Chapter 10. The New Imperialism and the Global Reconstruction of Cotton. In 1865, cotton manufacturers around the world faced the same problem. American slavery had ended, but the mills still needed cotton. The 4 million freed people who had grown that cotton now wanted something simple and revolutionary. They wanted land of their own. 40 acres and a mule, they said. Payment for centuries of unpaid labor. It was a reasonable request. It was also one that neither southern planters nor northern industrialists could afford to grant. What emerged instead was sharecropping, a system that looked like freedom but functioned like bondage. A freed family would work a plot of land, keeping half the crop while giving half to the landowner. It seemed fair enough at first glance. Families could work at their own pace without overseers watching their every move. They could keep gardens, raise chickens, maintain some dignity, but the mathematics of sharecropping were designed to fail. Everything the sharecropper needed came from the landowner or the local merchant, often the same person. Seeds, tools, food to last until harvest, all provided on credit at interest rates that would make a modern payday lender blush. The merchant would place a lien on the future crop, meaning the cotton belonged to him before it was even planted. A good year might let a family break even. A bad year meant deeper debt. Most years were bad years. The system required enforcement, and the South provided it abundantly. Black codes restricted where African Americans could live and work. Vagrancy laws made unemployment a crime punishable by forced labor. Between 1880 and 1930, over 3,000 African Americans were lynched, many for the crime of being too successful, of accumulating property that whites believed should be theirs. The violence was simply the cost of doing business in the Cotton South. European powers watched this American experiment carefully. The cotton famine had taught them a harsh lesson about depending on a single source for crucial raw materials. They needed their own cotton lands, under their own control. The scramble for Africa, already underway, accelerated dramatically. Britain took Egypt and Sudan. France claimed vast stretches of West Africa. Germany seized territories in East Africa. Belgium turned the Congo into what one observer called a vast plantation. The British Cotton Growing Association, founded in 1902, coordinated this global project. Manchester manufacturers and Liverpool merchants pooled resources to transform colonial territories into cotton suppliers. They brought in experts, funded agricultural stations, and pressured colonial governments to prioritize cotton above all else. One German economist put it bluntly: growing colonial cotton was the only way to escape American rape of the market. The transformation of these territories followed a predictable pattern. First came the railways, pushing from coastal ports deep into the interior. The railroad to Kamgaon in central India opened up what administrators called one of the very finest cotton fields in India. Telegraph lines followed the rails, connecting remote growing regions to the cotton exchanges of Liverpool and New York. After the transatlantic cable was completed in 1866, price changes in Manchester reached Indian villages within hours. Colonial administrators then rewrote the rules of rural life. They imposed private property where land had been held communally for centuries. They created land registries and title deeds, documents that could be mortgaged when crops failed. They introduced taxes that had to be paid in cash, not crops, forcing peasants to grow cotton to earn money. They established courts that enforced contracts with imprisonment, giving merchants unprecedented power over farmers. When legal mechanisms proved insufficient, colonial states used direct coercion. In the Belgian Congo, cotton cultivation became mandatory. Each village received a production quota. Those who failed to meet it faced the shikot, a whip made from hippopotamus hide that could strip flesh from bone. In French West Africa, administrators could imprison anyone for 15 days without trial under the indigenat system. They used this power liberally during planting and harvest seasons. European trading companies penetrated deep into rural areas that had never seen white faces before. Firms like Switzerland's Volkart brothers built cotton gins and warehouses in Indian villages. Japanese corporations established buying stations across China. These companies offered credit before planting season. advances that had to be repaid in cotton at prices the companies set. Local merchants, who had managed this trade for generations, found themselves reduced to agents of foreign firms or driven out entirely. By 1900, the reconstruction was complete. Cotton prices set in Liverpool and New York futures markets reached the remotest villages within hours. Peasants in India, farmers in Egypt, sharecroppers in Mississippi, all found their lives governed by numbers on distant exchanges. The empire of cotton had been rebuilt without slavery, but coercion remained its foundation. Debt had replaced shackles, contracts had replaced whips, but cotton still ruled, and its rule was still written in misery. Chapter 11. The Return of the Global South. By 1900, something unexpected was happening in the world of cotton. The industry that Britain had dominated for a century was beginning to slip away, not through conquest or revolution, but through the slow, steady pressure of economics. British workers had fought for decades to win decent wages and bearable hours. They'd succeeded. Mill workers in Manchester now earned more in a week than their grandparents had seen in a month. But every victory for workers was a problem for owners, who watched their profits shrink as wages rose. The Amalgamated Spinners Association had become one of Britain's most powerful unions, negotiating contracts that captured real gains for its members. In Germany, spinners' wages rose 53% between 1865 and 1913. Workers had won the 8-hour day, safety regulations, restrictions on child labor. These victories, hard won through strikes and struggle, made European textiles more expensive to produce. Mill owners began looking elsewhere, searching for workers who couldn't yet demand such rights. They found them in Japan. In 1880, Japan had just 8,000 cotton spindles. By 1930, it had 7 million. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and ruthless in its methods. The Japanese state imported British machinery and British experts, but it didn't import British labor laws. As one observer noted, Japanese mills enjoyed perfect immunity from restrictive factory legislation. The workforce that powered this industrial miracle consisted almost entirely of young women recruited from impoverished farming villages. Company agents would arrive in rural areas, promising good wages and respectable work. The reality was different. These women lived in company dormitories, surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. They worked 12-hour shifts, alternating between day and night shifts weekly. They couldn't leave without permission. They couldn't marry without approval. Many never saw their wages, which were sent directly to their fathers. The Times of London reported with a mixture of admiration and alarm that Japanese workers put in 120 hours per week compared to Lancashire's maximum of 48. This wasn't efficiency. It was exploitation on a scale that Europe hadn't seen since the early days of the Industrial Revolution. By 1927, Japanese textiles were displacing British goods across Asia. Lancashire mill owners watched helplessly as markets they'd controlled for a century vanished. India, the great victim of British deindustrialization, began its own cotton renaissance. In Ahmedabad, local merchants who had grown rich during the American Civil War, cotton boom, started building mills. These men had been squeezed out of the raw cotton trade by European firms with better access to credit and shipping. They turned to manufacturing instead. By 1918, Ahmedabad had 51 mills employing 35,000 workers. The Indian mill owners had advantages their British competitors lacked. Their workers, drawn from the vast population impoverished by a century of colonial rule, would accept wages that British workers would riot over. The deindustrialization that had destroyed India's traditional textile industry had created millions of desperate people with no alternative to factory work. These new proletarians, as Marx would have called them, had been produced by the same process of dispossession that had created England's working class, but compressed into decades rather than centuries. Brazil followed a similar path after abolishing slavery in 1888. The end of slavery weakened the old planter elite who had dominated Brazilian politics. A new industrial class emerged, demanding and receiving protective tariffs that kept out foreign textiles. Brazilian mills sprouted in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, staffed by immigrants from Europe and freed slaves from the countryside. Everywhere this new industrialization occurred, it was women who bore the burden. In Japan, in India, in Brazil, young women made up the majority of textile workers. Patriarchal family structures meant their labor was cheap. Authoritarian governments ensured their resistance was futile. They were the new engine of global capitalism, their bodies disciplined to the rhythm of machines, their wages a fraction of what men earned, their struggles invisible to history. By 1930, the geography of cotton had shifted decisively. The global South, which had been forced to supply raw materials to northern factories, was building factories of its own. The empire of cotton was coming full circle, returning to the regions that had created it millennia before. But this wasn't a restoration. It was a new form of the same old exploitation, now truly global in scope. Chapter 12: The Age of Extremes. In August 1914, the guns of Europe began firing, and half a world away, cotton mills in Bombay started running extra shifts. The Great War had severed the shipping lanes that carried British textiles to Asia. Suddenly, markets that Manchester had controlled for a century were wide open. Indian mill owners couldn't believe their good fortune. Japanese manufacturers rushed to fill orders. Chinese entrepreneurs borrowed frantically to build new factories. The war meant death in European trenches. But for Asian textile manufacturers, it meant the opportunity they'd been waiting for. The numbers tell the story of this transformation. Between 1913 and 1931, while Britain and Germany lost spindles, China's spinning capacity grew by 297%. Mills sprouted along the Yangtze River and around Shanghai. Indian production doubled. Japanese exports flooded into markets from Indonesia to East Africa. territories that had bought British cloth for generations. The war had lasted 4 years, but that was long enough for Asian manufacturers to establish themselves as serious competitors. When peace came in 1918, British manufacturers expected their markets to return. They were wrong. The war had exhausted Britain financially and spiritually. The empire that had seemed eternal in 1900 now looked fragile. More importantly, Asian consumers had discovered that Indian and Japanese textiles were often better suited to their needs than British cloth. Local manufacturers understood local preferences. They could adjust quickly to changes in fashion or demand. The age of Lancashire's dominance was ending. Then came 1929 and the Great Depression, which struck the export-dependent British textile industry like a hurricane. Global trade collapsed. Countries that had bought British textiles now had no money for imports. The interwar period was, as one historian described it, an almost unmitigated disaster for British cotton. Between 1919 and 1939, 41% of Britain's spinning capacity vanished. Nearly half the workforce lost their jobs. Entire towns built around cotton mills became graveyards of abandoned factories. Fall River, Massachusetts, once America's cotton capital, suffered the same fate. Half its mills closed in the decade after 1920. Workers who had earned steady wages for generations found themselves in breadlines. The city's population began a decline that would continue for the rest of the century. What happened in Fall River was happening across the old industrial heartland. The geography of cotton was shifting, and no amount of nostalgia could reverse it. The Depression fueled a wave of nationalism that further accelerated this shift. In India, Mahatma Gandhi made the spinning wheel a symbol of resistance to British rule. The Swadeshi movement called for boycotting British goods and buying Indian-made cloth instead. This wasn't just politics, it was economics. Indian mill owners like Ambalal Sakalal Desai funded the independence movement. Understanding that political freedom meant economic opportunity, under pressure, the British were forced to repeal the excise duty that had handicapped Indian textiles for decades. Similar movements emerged across the colonized world. In China, patriots burned British cloth in public demonstrations. In Egypt, nationalists promoted local textiles as symbols of independence. In Brazil, the government imposed tariffs that made imported cloth prohibitively expensive. Each country was building walls around its textile industry, protecting it from foreign competition, while it grew strong enough to compete globally. The Second World War, beginning in 1939, completed what the First had started. The British cotton industry was converted to war production. Mills that had made cloth for dresses now made parachutes and uniforms. When the war ended in 1945, these mills found their machinery obsolete and their markets gone forever. Asian manufacturers had spent the war years consolidating their dominance. There would be no comeback for Lancashire. This period of war and depression was more than just economic disruption. It was what scholars call a phase of capitalist restructuring, a violent reordering of the global economy. The crises destroyed old patterns of production and trade, creating space for new ones to emerge. Millions of people were displaced, their traditional livelihoods destroyed, forcing them into factories in Bombay or Shanghai or Sao Paulo. The violence of 2 world wars and a global depression had shifted the center of textile production back to where it had begun centuries before. By 1950, the empire of cotton had a new map. Britain, which had clothed the world, now imported textiles. The United States, once a major exporter, focused on its domestic market. The future belonged to Asia, to countries that had been colonies when the century began. The wheel had turned full circle, but this return brought no restoration of what had been. Instead, it brought new forms of exploitation, new patterns of inequality, new struggles between workers and owners that would define the next chapter of capitalism's global story. Chapter 13: Decolonization and the New Global Order. The British left India at midnight on August 15th, 1947. After 2 centuries of colonial rule, the subcontinent was free. In the textile mills of Ahmedabad and Bombay, workers celebrated through the night. They believed independence would bring not just political freedom, but economic justice, better wages, shorter hours, dignity at work. These hopes would soon collide with a different reality. The new Indian state had its own plans for the cotton mills, and those plans required workers to sacrifice for the nation. Across Asia and Africa, empires were crumbling. Indonesia freed itself from the Dutch. Vietnam fought off the French. Ghana became the first African nation to gain independence in 1957. By 1960, the year of Africa, 17 nations had thrown off colonial rule. Each new flag raised was a victory against centuries of exploitation. Yet, as one historian notes, decolonization became perhaps the single most significant event in the history of 20th century capitalism, not because it ended capitalism, but because it transformed it. The leaders of these new nations faced an immediate problem. Political independence meant little without economic strength. Prime Minister Nehru of India, President Nasser of Egypt, Chairman Mao of China, all understood that real sovereignty required industrial power. They'd seen how Britain had used its textile mills to dominate the world. Now they would build their own mills, their own path to prosperity. The strategy they chose was import substitution. Build factories at home, protect them with high tariffs, and stop depending on foreign goods. India's approach was typical. Nehru, influenced by industrialists like Purushottamdas Thakurdas, who had funded the independence movement, launched 5-year plans modeled partly on Soviet examples. The state poured resources into textile production. Mills received subsidized credit, protected markets, and guaranteed profits. By 1960, India was producing more cloth than it had at any point under British rule. The mills of Bombay ran 3 shifts a day, their smokestacks marking India's arrival as an industrial power. Egypt followed a similar path under Gamal Abdel Nasser. In the 1960s, he nationalized the cotton industry, turning private mills into state enterprises. The Missa Spinning and Weaving Company became one of the largest textile operations in the world, employing tens of thousands of workers. NASA promised that industrialization would make Egypt the Japan of the Middle East. Cotton, which had enriched foreign merchants for centuries, would now build Egyptian socialism. China's transformation was the most dramatic. After the Communist Revolution of 1949, the state seized all textile mills. Private ownership ended overnight. The new government launched a massive expansion, building hundreds of new factories. By 1957, just 8 years after the revolution, China had become the world's third largest cotton manufacturer, producing 2.5 times more yarn than the United Kingdom. The mills that had once enriched Shanghai's capitalists now served the People's Republic. Yet for the workers in these mills, liberation often meant simply a change of masters. The new states, desperate to accumulate capital and catch up with the West, often proved harsher than the colonial authorities they'd replaced. In India, independent unions were crushed when they threatened production targets. In Egypt, strikes were banned as counter-revolutionary. In China, workers who failed to meet quotas faced public humiliation or worse. The tools of colonial control, as one scholar notes, were deployed with even greater radicalism by the new national states. The alliance between workers and nationalists that had sustained the anti-colonial struggle quickly fractured. During the independence movements, mill workers had been heroes of the nation, their strikes against foreign owners celebrated as patriotic resistance. After independence, those same strikes were condemned as sabotage. The state that workers had fought to create now demanded their submission. Building the nation required sacrifice, leaders explained, and workers must bear their share. Meanwhile, the old cotton centers of Europe and New England continued their terminal decline. Britain, which had once produced enough textiles to clothe half the world, now imported cotton goods from its former colonies. The mills of Lancashire stood empty, their windows broken, their machinery sold for scrap. American textile towns like Lowell and Fall River became museums of industrial archaeology. The empire of cotton had shifted decisively back to the global south. By 1970, the transformation was complete. Asia produced more textiles than Europe and America combined. The new post-colonial states had succeeded in building their national industries, but the workers in these industries found themselves trapped in familiar patterns. Long hours, low wages, dangerous conditions, authoritarian management. The flag flying over the factory had changed, but life on the shop floor remained much the same. Capitalism had survived decolonization by adapting to it, and the empire of cotton continued its reign under new management. Chapter 14: Globalization and the Race to the Bottom. In 1963, the Liverpool Cotton Association held an auction, not for cotton, but for its own furniture. Desks where global prices had been set, chairs where fortunes had been made, filing cabinets that held the records of an empire. Everything had to go. The association that had ruled the world's cotton trade for over a century was closing its doors. Britain's share of global cotton exports had fallen to less than 3%. The empire of cotton had a new master, and it wasn't a country or even a company. It was something more abstract and more powerful. The last cotton mill in Fall River, Massachusetts, shut down in 1965. The machines that had run continuously for 100 years fell silent. Workers who had spent their entire lives in the mills found themselves obsolete. Some became janitors in the new shopping malls. Others simply gave up, joining the ranks of what economists coldly call the permanently unemployed. Across New England and Old England, industrial cities became museums of their former selves. While the old cotton centers died, a new system was being born. Companies like Walmart and Gap discovered they didn't need to own factories to control production. They could simply tell factories what to make, when to make it, and most importantly, what they'd pay for it. These retailers became the new emperors of cotton, ruling through purchase orders rather than ownership. A buyer in Arkansas could command production in Bangladesh, Vietnam, or Honduras without ever visiting these countries. This system created what economists celebrate as global supply chains. A shirt sold in London might be made from cotton grown in Texas, spun into yarn in Indonesia, woven into cloth in China, cut and sewn in Bangladesh, with buttons from Vietnam and zippers from Japan. Each step happened wherever labor was cheapest and regulations weakest. Capital had become like water, flowing instantly toward the lowest point. The results were predictable. Factories competed desperately for orders from Western brands, and the only way to compete was to cut costs. Wages fell, hours lengthened, safety standards disappeared. When workers in South Korea won better conditions in the 1980s, production moved to China. When Chinese wages began rising in the 2000s, factories relocated to Bangladesh and Cambodia. This race to the bottom seemed to have no flaw. The workforce powering this new empire consisted overwhelmingly of young women, just as it had in Manchester 2 centuries earlier. They migrated from rural villages destroyed by World Bank structural adjustment programs that had eliminated agricultural subsidies and opened markets to cheap imports. With no way to survive on the land, they flocked to export processing zones in Dhaka, Phnom Penh, and Ho Chi Minh City. They lived in dormitories, worked 14-hour days, and sent most of their meager wages back to families in the countryside. The human cost of this system became horrifyingly clear on April 24, 2013. The Rana Plaza factory complex in Bangladesh collapsed, killing 1,134 garment workers. They had been ordered to work despite visible cracks in the building's walls. They were making clothes for Walmart, Benetton, and other Western brands. Their bodies were found still clutching the garments they'd been sewing. The building's owner was politically connected and had ignored safety regulations. The brands claimed they didn't know about the dangerous conditions. Everyone pointed fingers at everyone else. This new empire of cotton operates beyond the control of any single government. When Bangladesh tries to enforce safety standards, brands threaten to move production to Myanmar. When Cambodia's workers demand higher wages, factories relocate to Ethiopia. Corporations have freed themselves from the regulations and taxes of nation-states, while still depending on those states to suppress unions and maintain order. The system is both stateless and state-dependent. American cotton farmers still receive massive government subsidies, $35 billion between 1995 and 2010, allowing them to sell cotton below the cost of production. This destroys cotton farming in Africa, forcing more farmers off their land and into the migrant streams that feed the garment factories. Chinese factories receive state support while brutally suppressing independent unions. Every government claims to want better conditions for workers while doing everything possible to keep labor cheap. The empire of cotton has come full circle in the worst possible way. It began with violence and coercion, with slavery and colonialism. Today's system is less overtly brutal, but no less effective at extracting value from human bodies. Young women in Bangladeshi factories work under conditions that would have appalled even 19th century reformers. The tools of control have become more sophisticated, but the fundamental relationship remains the same. Those who make the world's clothing cannot afford to buy it. The empire of cotton still rules, and its rule is still written in human suffering. Chapter 15. The Future of Capitalism. The empire of cotton has ruled for 500 years. It began with the enclosure of English commons and the enslavement of African peoples. It created the factory system and the modern working class. It de-industrialized ancient civilizations and rebuilt them as suppliers of raw materials. Today, it employs millions in sweatshops from Dhaka to San Salvador, producing clothes for consumers who will never know their names. This empire has generated extraordinary wealth and extraordinary misery, often in the same moment, always from the same process. The numbers tell one story. In the 1950s, a Chinese farming family needed 60 days of labor to produce their basic clothing for a year. Today, an American family spends the equivalent of 8 days' wages on a wardrobe that would have astounded royalty a century ago. Capitalism has unleashed productive forces beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. The question has never been whether the system can produce goods. The question has always been who controls that production and who benefits from it. Cotton farmers in Benin make about $1 a day growing the crop that clothes the world. Meanwhile, American cotton businesses received $35 billion in government subsidies between 1995 and 2010. A seamstress in Bangladesh earns in a month what her clothes will sell for in minutes at a Western mall. As one historian writes, civilization and barbarity are linked at the hip. The abundance capitalism creates has always depended on the poverty it simultaneously produces. But there's another story running through these 5 centuries, a story of resistance that began the moment the first hedge went up around the first common field, when English peasants tore down enclosures in the 1500s, when enslaved Africans burned cotton fields in the 1800s, when Lawrence mill workers struck in 1912, when Bangladeshi garment workers walked out in 2013, they were all fighting the same fight, not just for better wages or shorter hours, but for control over their own lives. Silvia Federici calls this the struggle to reclaim the commons, not just the literal commons of shared land, but the deeper commons of human solidarity and mutual aid. Every strike is an attempt to assert collective power against individual ownership. Every occupation of abandoned land is a claim that survival matters more than property rights. Every protest against corporate agriculture is a defense of traditional knowledge against commodification. The Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, understood this when they rose up in 1994 against NAFTA's threat to their communal lands. They weren't just fighting a trade agreement. They were fighting the latest attempt to enclose their commons, to turn their subsistence economy into another node in global supply chains. Their slogan, "Everything for everyone, nothing for ourselves," imagines a world organized around different principles entirely. When Indian farmers protest against corporate seed monopolies, they're defending thousands of years of agricultural knowledge that Monsanto wants to patent and sell back to them. When Bangladeshi garment workers demand wages that allow them to feed their families, they're insisting that human needs matter more than profit margins. When indigenous communities fight pipeline construction through their territories, they're asserting that some things shouldn't be for sale. These struggles are happening everywhere, though we rarely connect them. The fight against water privatization in Bolivia, the occupation of abandoned buildings by homeless families in Brazil, the community gardens spreading through Detroit's abandoned lots, the cooperative factories run by workers in Argentina, each represents an attempt to create spaces outside the logic of the market, to build what some scholars call economies of life against economies of accumulation. Women remain at the center of these struggles, as they have been since the witch hunts. They fight for reproductive rights against states that want to control their bodies. They demand recognition and payment for the care work that makes all other work possible. They organize community kitchens in poor neighborhoods, create informal networks of mutual support, maintain the social bonds that capitalism constantly tries to break. The empire of cotton shows us that capitalism exists in what scholars call a state of permanent revolution. Its rules and geography are constantly being remade through struggle. 500 years ago, no one could have imagined that the entire world would be reorganized around wage, labor, and commodity production. Today, it's equally hard to imagine it organized any other way. But the history we've traced shows that what seems permanent is actually contingent. What seems natural is actually enforced. The future isn't written. It will be determined by the outcome of struggles happening right now in factories and fields, in parliaments and streets, in every place where people assert that their lives matter more than profit. The empire of cotton has ruled for 5 centuries, but empires do fall. The question isn't whether this system will last forever. Nothing does. The question is what will replace it, and whether that something will finally fulfill the promise that has driven 5 centuries of resistance. A world where everyone has enough, where work serves life rather than destroying it, where the commons belong to all.